When we talk about pivotal years in Cold War history, 1949 ranks as one of the most important, even if it may not be the first one that springs to mind. It was a year where the events, reactions, and processes that had been ongoing since the end of the Second World War came to fruition. The strength of the communist world was tremendously expanded, adding not only an Asian giant to its ranks, but also reinforced with atomic weapons. In response, new countries were established and defensive alliances formed, solidifying East versus West. In the background, but no less important, culture and society everywhere was shifting and changing. I'm your host David, and 1949 was a busy year in the Cold War, so let's get going. This is the Cold War. We're going to start our year in review in the idyllic Mediterranean nation of Greece. While 1945 had largely ended the fighting in Europe, it raged on in the Aegean. Bitterly divided between the monarchist government being supported initially by the British and then later by the United States, and a communist insurgency supported by Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Albania, and the Soviet Union, Greece had been waging a civil war since 1944, when an Allied-imposed coalition had collapsed. 1945 had seen the communists agree to a halt in military operations, but the fighting resumed again in 1946 after the Royalists won elections and restored the monarchy. Now, up to this point, the monarchists had been supported by the British. Of course, the Brits were themselves exhausted, physically and financially, from the Second World War, and found themselves no longer in a position to provide aid to the Greek anti-communists. It was at this point that the Americans stepped in and, using the newly proclaimed Truman Doctrine, took over support to the Greeks. On the communist side of the Civil War, the majority of their support came from Tito and the Yugoslavians, who themselves were undergoing a rather prominent divorce from Moscow. When the majority of Greek communists chose to side with Stalin, Tito cut off his support for them, not only by cutting off supplies, but also by closing the border, depriving the leftists from training and rest areas. Stalin, however, had no interest in supporting the Greek communists, as he recognized Greece as being in the Western sphere of influence. By 1949, the remaining communist insurgents in Greece agreed to stop fighting and were evacuated to the Soviet Union, and with that, the Greek Civil War came to an end. The Civil War is often viewed as a significant victory for the West over the Soviet Union and communism, as Greece remained a nation firmly in the West, even joining NATO in 1952. Significantly, the Greek Civil War marked the first major US-led involvement in Europe to stop the spread of communism. Their success there marked the start of 40 more years of US-led involvement around the world to try and halt the Red Menace. Now, speaking of Truman, how's that for a segue? 1949 saw Harry Truman's second inauguration after his election in November of 1948. So you might be asking yourself why an inauguration is important. I mean, you're right, they happen every 4 years after all, nothing overtly special. Except Truman's second inauguration set some firsts. Held at the East Portico of the US Capitol, Truman's 1949 inauguration was the first to be televised. It was also the first inauguration where an African-American musician performed, the jazz pianist Lionel Hampton. The inauguration included a march past of military units, sporting new equipment after several years of military spending cutbacks. Notably, the parade included mixed-race units, a first, following Truman's 1948 Executive Order 9981, officially desegregating the US military. Included in the parade overall was an air parade, a flyby of over 600 planes. And watching it all were over 1.3 million Americans in Washington, D.C. itself, with millions more watching on TV and listening on the radio. The prominence of the military in the inaugural events was in part a reflection of the lasting legacy of the Second World War, but was also symbolic of the ever-deepening of the new Cold War and America's prominent role in it. Of course, America's military role on the world stage became more formalized in 1949 with the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Since even before the end of the Second World War, the Soviet Union and the United States had been sizing each other up as global rivals. With the end of the war, as the rivalry established itself, other countries chose which side of the divide they wanted to be on, or had their side chosen for them, depending. In Europe, the military powerhouse that had been Germany was destroyed, with part of it occupied by the Soviet Union and backed by its new allies in Central and Eastern Europe. Now, the US had intervened in European wars twice before, and the notion of continued transatlantic cooperation was strong. The countries of Western Europe recognized that even together, they were vulnerable to the military threat posed by the USSR and desired American involvement. For perspective, in the last 4 years, they had witnessed the Sovietization of various nations, and in April of 1949, the western portion of the city of Berlin was still isolated from the Western Germany and only supported by means of the ongoing Berlin airlift. All of the discussions surrounding collective security led to the establishment of a military alliance. On the 5th of April 1949, NATO was established, originally consisting of Belgium, Britain, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, and the United States. NATO was a defensive alliance standing in direct opposition to the Soviet Union. In response, although for a variety of reasons it took 6 years, the Soviet-led nations in Europe formed the Warsaw Pact in 1955. Each saw the other as symbols of aggression and have come to be seen by many as representing the Cold War itself. Now, speaking of the Berlin airlift, it ended in May of 1949 with the Soviets lifting the blockade, accepting that the Allies would do what was necessary to protect their zones of occupation in the city. Keep in mind, though, that simply because the blockade was lifted, tensions didn't really subside, and the root of those tensions was the status of occupied Germany itself. The Potsdam Agreement in 1945 had accepted that the four powers would occupy Germany, but left the question of what to actually do with Germany to be settled later. Well, it was 1949 and that question had yet to be settled. In fact, the temporary agreement that had been reached was becoming more and more permanent. In May, the American, French, and British occupation zones, which had been administered independently to that point, were merged into one single zone. And then on the 23rd of the same month, the West German Parliamentary Council declared the establishment of the Federal Republic of Germany. The president of the council, Konrad Adenauer, became the first chancellor of West Germany. Of course, this new state happened with the permission and encouragement of the Western Allies, who were not only eager to divest themselves of the day-to-day administration of their occupation zones, but recognizing that the unification of Germany was just not to be, made the decision to create an ally to stand with them against the Soviets. Now, since every action has an equal and opposite reaction, the Soviets made the decision to end their occupation in the East, and in October of 1949, the DDR, or German Democratic Republic, was formed. East Germany, led by Wilhelm Pech, still housed Soviet troops, but officially as guests and not as occupiers. The two Germanys would progress along very different trajectories during the Cold War, but both at the center of the conflict. 1949 also saw the adoption of the Geneva Convention relative to the protection of civilian persons in time of war. This is most frequently just shortened to the Fourth Geneva Convention. Adopted in August, and unlike the prior three conventions, which had concerned themselves with combatants, the Fourth Convention dealt with the protection of civilians in a war zone. The terms of the Fourth Convention prohibit any kind of targeting of civilians in conflict zones. It defines the people who are to be protected in time of war. It also prohibits the torture, mistreatment, and execution of civilians. In addition, the deportation of those civilians from a combat zone was prohibited and outlined the obligations regarding civilian populations of the forces in general command of a conflict zone. While the Fourth Convention has certainly not always been adhered to, it did add to the framework of rules and laws by which wars should be conducted. For combatant forces through the Cold War era, no matter if they were trying to portray themselves as guerrilla freedom fighters or protectors of the state, some attempts to adhere to the so-called rules potentially helped their legitimacy, or vice versa. Shifting our attention from Geneva to the Vatican, 1949 saw the Church of Rome issue a decree regarding its view on communism. Now, it's no secret how communism regards religion. After all, Marx himself had stated that religion was the opium of the people. The Soviet Union also did a very poor job of hiding its animosity towards religion, not only making atheism the official ideology of the state, but also conducting various anti-religious campaigns, especially in the early years of the Republic. In that light, the Roman Catholic Church held communism in a very dim light, understandably so. Pope Pius XII, having been rather silent on the whole Holocaust thing, was motivated to take a more aggressive stance on the threat of communism. Two major factors contributed. With the communist takeovers in large parts of East and Central Europe, the Catholic Church was being directly harassed, and Catholics along with it. Secondly, there was a power struggle in Italy. The Christian Democratic Party was in control, largely seen as a party of the Church. However, the main opposition was made up of the communists. But don't be misled, many of those voting communist were themselves Catholic. So the Church, worried for Italy and the Church's place in it, decided to act. On the 28th of June, Pope Pius XII published a decree on the excommunication of communists from the Roman Catholic Church. According to the decree, due to the anti-religious position of communism, with it being anti-God and anti-materialistic, it was prohibited for Catholics to join communist parties, to disseminate communist leaflets, or to propagate the ideals of communism. People had to choose between their political ideals or a core and key part of their cultural and familial backgrounds. Moving east from the Vatican to Semipalatinsk, 1949 witnessed a literal seismic shift in the Cold War when on August 29th, the Soviet Union successfully detonated its first atomic weapon. The United States had enjoyed a monopoly on atomic weapons since 1945, but it also knew that the monopoly could not last forever. The Soviet Union had attempted, diplomatically, several times to create processes or mechanisms that would destroy and ban all nuclear weapons, but those attempts had all failed. At the same time, however, the Soviet Union had its own nuclear program led by Kurchatov. This program, which combined the independent work of Soviet scientists, knowledge captured from the German nuclear program at the end of the war, and American nuclear information obtained through an extensive spy network, allowed the USSR to rapidly advance their own program. The August test, codenamed Pervaya Molinya, or First Lightning, was approximately the same yield as the Trinity test conducted only 4 years earlier. A series of structures and construction projects that had been built surrounding the test site designed to examine the effects of the blast, First Lightning was powerful enough to destroy the test structures. Now, the test was naturally carried out in secret, and it was not announced to the Soviet people or the world that the test had been conducted. On September 1st, a US Air Force weather reconnaissance plane collected atmospheric samples while on a flight between Japan and Alaska, which, when analyzed, confirmed that the Soviet Union had joined the nuclear club. Elsewhere in the Soviet Union, away from the technological triumph of Soviet science, some of the darkest chapters of the Cold War were being written. The Baltic States, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, once a part of the Russian Empire, but independent during the interwar period, had been forcibly annexed by the Soviet Union during the war years. As the post-war period progressed, the new Soviet republics in the Baltics went through a process of Sovietization, but it was in no way a smooth ride. Partisan movements, the so-called Forest Brothers, put up stiff resistance to what they considered to be a Soviet occupation. Despite this, the Soviet authorities pushed forward with plans to collectivize the Baltic states and bring them under control. Both propaganda and repression campaigns were carried out, but the Sovietization was both slow and not very successful. Stalin, a man focused on results rather than humanitarianism, demanded the new republics be brought rapidly in line with the rest of the Soviet Union. On the 29th of January, the Council of Ministers of the Soviet Union made a secret decision to deport those who they perceived to be the main opponents to the Soviet regime. Based on that decision, Operation Priboy began on March 25th. Priboy arranged for the deportation eastwards of 20,000 Estonians, 41,000 Latvians, and 28,000 Lithuanians, most of them labeled as kulaks. Over the 3 days between the 25th and the 28th, 76 trains carrying 30,629 families into eternal exile traveled to distant locations such as Irkutsk, Amur, Krasnoyarsk, Novosibirsk, Omsk, and Tomsk oblasts. Living conditions in each area varied widely, but were for the most part very poor, with people living in barracks, sheds, mud huts, and even sharing space with locals already living there. Within a year, as many as 4,000 of the deportees had died. But Iboya was not the only set of targeted repressions that occurred in the Soviet Union that year. 1949 also saw Stalin turn on his own people, those in the party who he saw as a threat to his leadership and security in what has become known as the Leningrad Affair. So, to give a bit of background, we need to consider Leningrad's position in the Soviet Union. This city had been the capital of the empire, the seat of power and culture, and even after the revolution and the relocation of the capital to Moscow, Leningrad was a city that continued to exert influence. The resistance and resilience shown by the city during its 872-day siege by Nazi forces gave it and its leadership an almost mythic standing. It also gave the party leadership there an unprecedented degree of autonomy from the rest of the country. Stalin, who already had a suspicion of Leningrad-based rivals, Kirov, we're looking at you, felt he needed to act. In January of 1949, party members in Leningrad, including Pyotr Popkov, Alexei Kuznetsov, and Nikolai Vozhnesiensky, organized a trade fair in the city designed to showcase goods and services from across the Soviet Union. Now, despite the funding for this fair having already been approved by the Central Planning Committee, a propaganda campaign was launched accusing the party in Leningrad of misusing state funds for their own local aggrandizement. In the repressions that followed, organized by Malenkov, Beria, and Abakumov, over 2,000 members of the Leningrad party leadership, activists, decision-makers, and intelligentsia were arrested. Kuznetsov, Popkov, and Vozhnesiensky were executed for their supposed roles, and the influence of the Leningrad Party was largely broken. Incidentally, many of those prosecuted at this time were rehabilitated, even posthumously, by Khrushchev during the thaw. Shifting our attention now to Asia, the march of communism seemed ascendant when the long-fought struggle for overall dominance in China came to an end with the victory of Mao Zedong and his troops in their civil war against the nationalists, the KMT, led by Chiang Kai-shek. Early in the year, the communists launched the Pingjin campaign, which resulted in the KMT being pushed from the capital at Nanjing. By October 1st, with the KMT in retreat, Mao proclaimed the People's Republic of China from his new capital at Beijing. Although the KMT was defeated, they were not destroyed, and by December, approximately 2 million KMT troops had retreated to the island of Taiwan. Despite the efforts of the new regime on the mainland, they were unable to suppress the KMT regime in Taiwan, and the world was suddenly faced with two Chinas. While the Civil War had exacted a tremendous cost in China, claiming the lives of up to 6 million people, on the international geopolitical level, a new balance of power had been introduced. Although not considered a truly global power at the time, China had the ability to exert a great deal of influence in Asia, and the fear from the West that the ideological union of China and the Soviet Union would allow for the rapid spread of global communism. East Asia, considered by many in the West to be a backwater at the time, suddenly became a new battleground of the Cold War. Refocusing back to the Soviet Union for a moment, 1949 was significant from a mass culture perspective. This was the year when the first mass-produced TV in the Soviet Union became available. The KVN-49, named after the project coordinators, Koenigson, Varshavsky, and Nikolaevsky, was a black and white TV and weighed in at a whopping 29 kilos, that's 63 pounds. The screen was only 10 by 14 centimeters, that's 3.5 inches by 5 1/3 inches, so to make up for it, a large plastic disc was placed in front of the screen and, when filled up with water, acted like a magnifying glass. So, not quite 4K. Now, the KVN-49 also came with a reputation for being faulty, and the abbreviation for the name was jokingly called the Kupil, bought, Vluchil, turned on, and Nerabotyet, doesn't work. When it worked, citizens who could afford a TV could watch news programming, sporting events, political speeches, and cultural events. Coincidentally, 1949 was the first year that a football match was shown on TV as well. CSKA Moscow played Dynamo Moscow. Dynamo won, by the way. Now, for those who could not afford a TV in 1949, which would have included many across the country, there was always radio. That year saw a considerable increase in radio programming across the Soviet Union. This programming included similar fare to what was on television: news, sporting events, political speeches, and cultural events. Broadcasting for both TV and radio began at 6 a.m. and ended at midnight, and both opened and closed with the Soviet national anthem. Now, speaking of Soviet culture, the late 1940s saw the emergence of a unique Soviet counterculture, not something that really comes to mind for a lot of people given the repressive nature of the Stalinist regime. But, reminiscent of Russian imperial troops being influenced by their time in Europe during and after the Napoleonic Wars, members of the Red Army and of such groups like the Diplomatic Corps found themselves in much greater contact with non-Soviet citizens. Along with that came exposure to Western fashion, lifestyle, and music. Even the occupying troops in Central and Eastern Europe, despite the devastation, could see the remnants of Western lifestyle. Those service members abroad would often bring home trophies, especially items of clothing, which amid the austere nature of Soviet life could be prized possessions. What emerged were the so-called stylyagi, a rough translation from Russian being style hunters. Fashionable people looking to stand out from the norm. You know, hipsters. So there isn't a specific year that the stylyagi subculture emerged, but the first time the term was publicly recorded was in the March 10th edition of the journal Krokodil. It depicted a young man dressed in colorful and obviously foreign clothing, embarrassing himself with both his arrogance as well as his outlandish clothing. Stylyagi were characterized by not only colorful clothing, however, but also an interest in Western music, movies, and dances. It's within stylyagi culture that we see the development of the so-called bone music, used to clandestinely share songs. Although it stood in opposition to Stalinist conformity, stylyagi counterculture was largely apolitical. Despite this, it was repressed until after Stalin's death, and even then it was subject to heavy government propaganda, and those participating could be expelled from the Komsomol, as well as face abuse and attacks from government supporters. As in so many places, nonconformity came with a price. As we take a look at the events that broke the mold in 1949, the role of women in international politics took a significant step forward that year. The post-war period, like the pre-war period, is notable for the near absence of female politicians. But in a growing atmosphere of liberation and emancipation, fueled by women's participation in the war effort, some women were making the decision to enter the world of politics. A prominent example, of course, is Eleanor Roosevelt, who played a key role in the development of UN human rights documents. 1949 saw a major milestone, however. That was the year that Eugenie Anderson was appointed United States Ambassador to Denmark. This made her the first female American ambassador in history appointed at the ambassador rank and not just chief of mission. Anderson, trained as a musician, even attending the renowned Juilliard School in New York, had become politically active in the late 1930s, a strong advocate against American isolationism. A staunch supporter of the Democratic Party and of Harry Truman, she received the nod to become the ambassador to Denmark in 1949. She was a trailblazer for an ever-increasing number of women involved in the State Department and in political life in general. Sticking with female empowerment, but switching to sports, 1949 saw Scandal rock the world of tennis. One of the most popular sports in the world at the time, the tennis calendar was dominated by the Grand Slam tournaments, with Wimbledon featuring prominently. Wimbledon then, much like now, had a reputation as one of the most conservative tournaments in tennis, especially with regards to dress code. The rules stated that players were to dress in mostly white, and any deviation from that was, well, against the rules. And then an American player named Gertrude Augusta Moran, whom everyone just referred to as Gussie, qualified to play in the 1949 tournament. Before the start of the tournament, she had asked to have an outfit designed with sleeves and skirt to each be a different color. Her requests were turned down. So instead, she had an outfit designed with a short skirt under which she wore lace-trimmed underwear. From the right angles while she played, spectators and cameramen could see her underwear, and the sport and even the British Parliament were aghast. Gussie Moran lost in the finals of the mixed doubles in 1949, but the scandal rocketed her to celebrity status. She continued to play tennis, but also appeared on magazine covers and worked in both television and in movies. Moran helped to revolutionize and modernize women's dress style in tennis and in sport in general. Now, speaking of sports, let's move from the grass court to the hard court in the sport of basketball. 1949 saw the establishment of the last of the Big Four major leagues in North America. Joining the NFL, MLB, and the NHL was the National Basketball Association. Before August 3, 1949, there were two major leagues playing basketball in the United States. The older of the two, the National Basketball League, was made up of teams from big cities like Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, and Pittsburgh, and a few smaller markets like Akron and Fort Wayne. Relatively weak in infrastructure, games were largely played in small gymnasiums. In 1946, however, the Basketball Association of America was founded, focusing largely on big markets like New York, Boston, Toronto, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, and St. Louis. By the 1948-49 season, the BAA had drawn the attention and talents of some of the game's best players, and even brought 4 NBL teams and their players into the BAA: Fort Wayne, Indianapolis, Rochester, and Minneapolis. With the Minneapolis Lakers came Mr. Basketball, George Mikan, considered one of the best players of all time. His talents alone could win a team a championship. His defection from the NBL to the BAA was a clear indication of which league was in the ascendance. August 3, 1949 saw representatives from both leagues meet in New York City and agree on a merger of the two leagues. The head of the BAA, Morris Podoloff, was elected the head of the new National Basketball Association. Made up of 17 teams that represented both large and smaller markets across the country, the NBA found mixed successes in its early years, but has grown to be one of the world's biggest sporting leagues with a truly global audience. Turning from the world of athletics to the world of literature, 1949 saw the first publication of what many considered to be one of the seminal works of the Cold War era. George Orwell's 1984 is one of the most famous and most referenced works of the 20th and 21st centuries. Some people referencing it have actually even read it. Heavily influenced by Yevgeny Zamyatin's 1923 work, We, 1984 is a dystopian novel focused on a totalitarian future where the state has complete control over the lives and minds of the people. The book is clearly written as a caution to its audience. Orwell was a socialist, having fought for the Republicans in the Spanish Civil War, trying to curb the expansion of fascism. But Orwell also found himself disillusioned with the Soviet Union and its policies, warning of the dangers of totalitarianism. The book helped introduce a new set of references into modern parlance, some of which are common today. Big Brother, for example, is a term commonly used, as is thought police, used widely today to criticize the power of security and police organizations around the world. The book is double plus good, and if you have not read it, please go do so. As we begin to wrap up this whirlwind tour of 1949, I am going to remind everybody that these episodes are not meant to be comprehensive reviews of an entire year. If they were, this video would go on forever, and by the end of it, my beard would have grown out so much I'd look like a bicycle mechanic. These videos also aren't meant to be necessarily the most important things. They're just a snapshot. If you're interested, do some research on some other topics from the year, like the formation of Comic-Con, Ireland becoming a republic, Newfoundland joining Canada as a province, and the first Alger Hiss trial. You could also read up on the first non-stop round-the-world flight, or the first flights of the de Havilland Comet, or the Avros C-102. 1949 was also the year that Sukarno assumed real control over Indonesia, and that EDSAC began computing at University of Cambridge. For those of you into highbrow entertainment, 1949 saw the introduction of Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner. And there are plenty of other events that we've not mentioned, which I'm sure will be pointed out in the comments. And finally, for 1949, the Eagles beat the LA Rams to win the NFL championship, while Portsmouth won the First Division title, and Wolverhampton Wolves won the FA Cup. In Italy, a plane crash killed all but one player from Torino Football Club in what has been called the Superga air disaster. The Yankees won the World Series, and golfer Sam Snead won both the Masters and the PGA Championship. The Toronto Maple Leafs swept the Red Wings to win the Stanley Cup, and the World Hockey Championship, Canada beat Denmark 47-0. And to round out sports, Ireland won the 55th Five Nations Championship. In music, Ghost Riders in the Sky, sung by Vaughn Monroe, spent 11 weeks at #1 in the United States, while at the movies, Jolson Sings Again was the highest grossing movie of the year, taking in a whopping $5 million. And that concludes our look at 1949. We hope that you've enjoyed today's episode, and to make sure you don't miss future episodes, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have pressed the bell button. Look, it's been a long week, so just press it. Sometimes I'm not feeling particularly creative. We'll try again next week. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com, and we're active on Facebook and Instagram at The Cold War TV. If you enjoy our work, please consider supporting us via www.patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. And don't forget, the trouble with the Cold War is that it doesn't take too long before it gets heated.